our speaker. Claire's an LLM in the Ockham parish, and through Christine has come to join our group and been a great addition to it. And she's got the toughest section of the book, I think, the speeches of Elihu from chapters 32 to 37. Now, I didn't set out to give her the toughest section of the book deliberately, but that's what she's got. So without further ado, welcome, Claire, and it's lovely to have you with us. Just to remind you of two things. First of all, I've been talking about possibly forming another group if there are enough people who are willing to come and do what Claire's going to do today. And I have a little thingy, which I'll put up there. If you're interested, please put your name down. Secondly, remember, Christine will come if you need to make a comment or ask a question. Just put up your hand, but don't speak until the microphone arrives. And don't touch the microphone. Apparently, we're not allowed to do that. Christine will stick it in your face, and you speak thereafter. Okay. So let's just pray first, and then we'll carry on. Lord, we thank you once again for this wonderful book in your scriptures, and we thank you for this opportunity to come together to study it, and we pray for Claire that you would be with her and guide her as she takes us through these chapters. And so we offer ourselves to you in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Claire, over to you.
Thank you. So, as Tim actually has now admitted, I've been given 6 chapters of the book of Job to deal with this morning, which is obviously quite a big section. So my approach to it is not going to be clearly to go through line by line. That would be impossible. We'd be here for weeks. So I've been selective in what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to explain to you the reasons why I chose to talk about what I am going to. First of all, though, I want to thank Christine and Tim so very much for including me in their Bible study group. And I'd like to thank the other people in the group, a few of whom are here this morning, who have made me so welcome and shared books and hospitality. I've thoroughly enjoyed being part of this group. So I joined the group a year ago when they were starting to study the Gospel of John, which has been a wonderful experience. And I can't recommend Bible study with Tim more highly, and I think you should all sign up, as he says. There's an opportunity this morning. But because I joined a year ago, that meant I was not part of the original group when they studied the book of Job in 2019. That's right, isn't it? 2019.
We did, yes. I think so, yes.
And I understand that in those sessions, the speeches of Elihu, which are what these 6 chapters contained, were omitted. So I think that Tim may have thought of me, a latecomer to the party, just as Elihu is thought to be, as you will hear, the right person to allocate these 6 chapters to. And I will be honest, this did cause me some dismay, but I took the view that I was lucky to be included at all. However, when the schedule was revisited, I did suggest that I could cover some other topic if that fitted in, but no, Tim wanted me to stick to Elihu, and so I have. But what could have been my reasons to be dismayed? Well, until I joined this study group, my knowledge of the book of Job was based very much on the writings of Rabbi Harold Kushner and his analysis of the book of Job called When Bad Things Happen to a Good Person. This was published in 2012. You may know his name because 30 years earlier he had written a book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and millions of copies of that book were sold. Now, the tragedy in Kushner's own life was that his son, Aaron, had died at the age of 14 of a rare genetic disorder called progeria. It's an untreatable condition in which the process of aging starts in early childhood. And of course now people understand the enzyme deficiency, although it's not known. It's not treatable. At the age of 14, Aaron looked like a small old man and died of heart failure just after his birthday. Kushner struggled to make sense of this and then produced his first book, which was about the kind of God he could have faith in and to whom he could turn to in a world where good people suffer and die. So 30 years later, he was asked to write a commentary on the book of Job. And Kushner is a Hebrew scholar of some renown, and he is ecstatic in his praise of the language and craft of the book of Job. And I hope, without stealing anybody's thunder, I do just want to tell you that I found his interpretation of the significance of the Leviathan and the Behemoth in God's speech in the whirlwind compelling and invaluable. And for me, that answered a lot of questions. So, what did Kushner have to say about Elihu's contribution? He writes, Elihu, son of Barakal, is a brash young man who, passing, overhears the conversation between Job and his visitors, and he is frustrated by the inability of Job's friends to do a better job of defending God. He interrupts them with the requisite apology for disagreeing with his elders. And then Kushner writes, in 6 rather tedious chapters, proceeds to tell them what they have overlooked. Kushner goes on to point out that whereas the medieval Jewish commentator Maimonides, 13th century, praised Elihu as the most perfect among the friends in knowledge, Kushner says modern critics, by contrast, tend to dismiss the Elihu chapters as the work of another hand and regard them as inferior to the rest of the book. Probably most disheartening in this respect is what Kushner writes. Professor Ginsberg calls Elihu the intruder, dismissing his orations as turgid and long-winded, and writing that the effort required to understand the Elihu speeches is out of all proportion to the profundity of thought. This Professor Ginsberg is both a revered mentor of Kushner and also Greenstein, who was the commentator of the book of Job in the Jewish Study Bible. So a great authority. Another commentator agrees with those who dismissed Elihu's chapters as having scant value, either as literature or as a solution to the problem of evil. Ballantyne points out that Elihu speaks for 159 uninterrupted verses. Apart from Job, he has more lines than any character in the book, including God. The numbers may add up to a little more than bluster and banality. So could that be why I was dismayed? But then Tim pointed me in the direction of Carol Newsom's book, The Book of Job, A Contest of Moral Imaginations, which provided me with a completely different perspective. I think that all the speakers on this course have so far found Newsom's book invaluable, and several have pointed out that she is of the view that a single author wrote the book except for Elihu's speeches. Others have explained her reasons for so arguing and what is achieved by this being considered as a polyphonic text. But this morning, I'm going to focus on her interpretation of Elihu and his speeches. Now, by way of introduction, she does start by admitting the majority of critics in the 20th century are hostile to him, often treating him as an object of ridicule. But she writes, "I'm certainly not going to argue for a rehabilitation of Elihu as the moral centre of the book. No more than most of my modern colleagues do I find his arguments compelling. But I do want to view him with more dispassionate and deliberately generous curiosity," and that's what she does. So she herself, although rather unusually, she argues that the whole book was written by one author, which in itself is a rather extraordinary way of looking at it, but it gives a real insight. She does say that Elihu's speeches are of a later addition to the book. And there are really 5 good reasons for thinking this. Elihu is not mentioned either in the prologue nor in the epilogue. The prose introduction of Elihu in chapter 32 differs in tone and style from the introduction of the other characters, as does the extended genealogical information supplied for Elihu in chapter 32, verse 2. The style of Elihu's refutation of Job differs sharply from those of the friends. He calls Job by name 9 times, quotes from the preceding debate, and according to Newsom, shows an awareness and skillfully anticipates themes, imagery, and style of the divine speeches. In other words, this is an author who studied the book very carefully from end to end. Also, apparently, there is a distinctive linguistic profile in Elihu's speeches, which include numerous Aramaisms. Now, there's a marvellous word, 2 words, called a harpex legomenon. Is that right?
That'll do, yes.
That'll do, okay.
Yes.
Sorry?
Hapex legomenon.
There are more hapex legomenon in the book of Job than virtually any other biblical source. And do they occur particularly in Elihu's speeches?
I'm not sure.
Okay, but just the fact that he's got so many of these Aramaisms in it, which are the things I think that trip up Hebrew scholars, aren't they?
Yes, I think there are probably more of them in the Elihu speeches
yes.
than there would be in others, yeah.
Thank you. And the final objection to Elihu, as if we hadn't heard enough, is that in the structure of the book, Elihu's speeches come between Job's final speech. This is the last thing Job says, and this is his oath of piety. And then we're all waiting for God's reply. And what do we get? We get 6 chapters of Elihu. Thus, Elihu appears as someone who has defaced a cultural monument with his graffiti, so says Newsom. Now, Newsom says we do not know how much time elapsed between the composition of the book of Job and the introduction of Elihu's speeches, but there is enough to produce a small but discernible gap between the culture of moral argument presumed by the main part of the book and that of Elihu. For Elihu's generation, the moral world has tilted on its axis sufficiently for moral and religious issues to be configured differently. Now, according to modern-day thinking, these changes are really subtle, and it has taken the insight and perspicacity of Professor Carol Newsom to recognise and explain the significance of those differences. And because Newsom has such a positive message about Elihu's speeches, in contrast to the many other commentators, in this limited time review, I'm going to base what I say mostly on her work. So if we start, Tim, would you read chapter 32 from verse 1 to 10 and then 18 to 22, please?
So these 3 men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, son of Baruchel the Buzite, of the family of Ram, became angry. He was angry at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He was angry also at Job's 3 friends because they had found no answer, though they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. But when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouths of these 3 men, he became angry. Elihu, son of Baruchel, the Buzite, answered, I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak, and many years teach wisdom. But truly, it is the spirit in a mortal, the breath of the Almighty, that makes for understanding. It is not the old that are wise, nor the aged that understand what is right. Therefore I say, listen to me. Let me also declare my opinion. For I am full of words. The spirit within me constrains me. My heart is indeed like wine that has no vent. Like new wineskins, it is ready to burst. I must speak so that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer. I will not show partiality to any person or use flattery toward anyone, for I do not know how to flatter, or my Maker would soon put an end to me.
So, Newsom regards this chapter as introducing the concept of Elihu as an inspired youth. Elihu considers the 3 friends have stopped too soon without saying what is most necessary. They've become lost for words, in contrast to Elihu, who is filled with words as an unvented wineskin about to burst. Now, it's that image of himself that many commentators have used to point ridicule at Elihu. I actually think it's rather good. Think of all those things that are past their sell-by date in the fridge and start to tent up. You can well see what he means. The deference that youth owes to age and the presumption that age correlates with superior wisdom are principles already well established in these dialogues and in culture in general. I am young in age is the rhetoric of politeness, but it is also the sort of description that occurs in narratives concerning the divine choice of an exceptional leader against cultural norms. Elihu points out, as Tim read, but truly it is the spirit in a mortal, the breath of the Almighty, that makes for understanding. So that's really his argument. It's not age alone that is the source of wisdom. It is the possession of divine spirit, perhaps that he, Elihu, has been given. Therefore, I say, listen to me. Let me also declare my opinion. And then he does go on in chapter 33 to say, pay heed, Job. Listen to me. Be silent, and I will speak. If you have anything to say, answer me. Speak. For I desire to justify you. If not, listen to me. Be silent, and I will teach you wisdom. And Newsom points out that although he invites Job to reply, the author of Elihu's speeches has no interest whatsoever in imagining counter-arguments. Now, Catherine Dell, whose commentary on Elihu's speeches appears initially to be sympathetically inclined, then changes to writing of this chapter, next chapter, I think, that he comes over as rather self-righteous. By chapter 35, she's writing of a slight cockiness of youth emerging. By chapter 36, she says Elihu's confidence seems to be reaching new heights. He claims to be speaking on God's behalf. Wilson likewise writes that in chapter 36, even more damaging for Elihu's credibility is his self-description as one who is complete or perfect in knowledge. Harble comments, to boast about one's integrity comes with ill grace from a youth who has experienced none of the sufferings of Job and yet pretends to gainsay his arguments. For Elihu to claim he's equal with Job is presumptuous, to say the least. Now, several commentators have... Yes, Barry.
Does Elihu's name have any particular significance? And associated with that, what word are we using here for God? Have we got the L people translating this, or is it something else?
El would be used for God most often in this book. And Elihu obviously has some connection with God, as the prefix El would indicate.
Is he the only one that can be identified as Jewish of all the characters? All the others are specifically not Jewish?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure.
I only mention it because I think I have read that.
Yeah, it could well be, yes.
And his name does relate in some way to the name of...
Yes. El is generally is a broader description of God, actually attributable in many of the ancient religions. Yahweh is the particularly Jewish God.
He doesn't use that.
That is the holiest name of God, which Jews will not speak, is Yahweh. Yeah.
Do you have further comment, Barry?
I was just saying the other friends were Edomites, weren't they? So this is, as you say, one who's different.
Yes.
Yes, though I don't think that... I think the book is so located in nowhere, as I've indicated, that I don't think that he's Jewish actually makes any difference to the book itself. Particularly, it's more his age, which is and wisdom, his claim to speak wisdom, that is important. Yeah.
Thank you. So several commentators have located Elihu's ideas in relationship to the book of Koheleth or Syriac and the book of Daniel. So these are all 3rd and 2nd century BCE. In other words, late Persian or early Hellenistic dates. And that in such writings, the image of the inspired youth who bests his elders has become something of a cultural image in the moral imagination. Elihu is perhaps suggesting God has given him insights which will permit him to succeed where older and presumably wiser authors have failed. I think you'll see he sees himself a bit like Daniel. So Newsom would say that she's really saying that he's much influenced by late Persian or Hellenistic dates. I looked through your introduction to Job to see what dates you gave the book, and would it be true to say either pre or post-exile?
Yes, well, really, the whole Old Testament was edited in the way we have it, form we have it, after the exile. So in the form we have it, although it uses older materials, obviously it's a redaction in the light of the exile, and that's true of Job as well.
So, but I mean, we could say it was 6th century, could we?
Yes.
For these purposes?
Yes, 5th or 6th century, late 6th century, somewhere around the early 5th century maybe, yeah, somewhere around there. It's after the exile. So the exile finishes in 528. So it's some time after that. But.
So Newsom is proposing that Elihu's contribution could have been 300 years later, approximately.
Okay. Indeed, yeah.
Yes.
So very late writing, yeah.
Much later,
yeah.
Yes. Interestingly, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the version of Job has got Elihu in it.
Yes, oh,
yes.
Okay, right.
So Newsom points to 4 differences between Elihu and the others in the book of Job, which she thinks deserve further consideration. And the first 2 differences have been observed by other commentators, and the first is Elihu's appropriation of Job's forensic metaphor, which occurs in chapters 33 and 35. The second, his is his argument about redemptive suffering, which occurs in 33. But then she points out to other similarities between late Persian or early Hellenistic writings, which have not been commented on before, which may shed some light on Elihu's words. And these are the similarities with imagery in Daniel 2 and 5, relating to kings and rulers, which we see in chapter 34, and also Elihu's wisdom genre, otherwise known only from Syriac, chapters 36 to 37. And in these examples, she considers how Elihu's moral imagination does indeed differ from that of other books, other voices in the book. So now, Tim, if you could read chapter 33, verses 12b to 28, please.
God is greater than any mortal. Why do you contend against him, saying, he will answer none of my words? For God speaks in one way and in two, though people do not perceive it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on mortals, while they slumber on their beds, then he opens their ears and terrifies them with warnings, that he may turn them aside from their deeds and keep them from pride, to spare their souls from the pit, their lives from traversing the river. They are also chastened with pain upon their beds, and with continued strife in their bones, so that their lives loathe bread and their appetites dainty food. Their flesh is so wasted away that it cannot be seen, and their bones, once invisible, now stick out. Their souls draw near the pit, and their lives to those who bring death. Then, if there should be for one of them an angel, a mediator, one of 1,000, one who declares a person upright, and he is gracious to that person, and says, deliver him from going down into the pit, I have found a ransom. Let his flesh become fresh with youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Then he prays to God and is accepted by him. He comes into his presence with joy, and God repays him for his righteousness. That person sings to others and says, I have sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not paid back to me. He has redeemed my soul from going down to the pit, and my life shall see the light.
Well, chapter 33, the one that Tim's just read, is generally considered to be Elihu's most significant contribution. Harbel sees this chapter as containing two sets of materials. The first one that Tim has not read, which are those dealing with the legal process and those countering Job's claim that El does not communicate with human beings. And Harbel translation is such that he uses very legalistic language, and he makes out that Elihu is taking a highly legalistic approach to the situation Job finds himself in, which is continued into chapter 34. He points out the framing of Elihu's first speech is replete with echoes of Job's speech in chapter 13, verses 17 to 19, a passage in which Job rather explicitly invokes legal terminology and relationships. And it also includes Job's formal request for public litigation proceedings to be instigated against God. And that, in fact, it's Elihu alone amongst the friends of Job who recognizes and responds to this legal framing of Job's argument, specifically his request for an arbiter or judge, which Alison read last week. Would that there was an umpire, chapter 9, verse 33. But there was no umpire forthcoming, so that's where Elihu steps up as attorney for the defense, according to Harbel. And in chapter 33, demonstrates how Elihu accepts Job's legal challenge against El and assumes the role of defendant for God in the lawsuit in chapter 34. So that was Harbaugh's take on this, but the section that Tim has read out really has, Newsom makes a different emphasis on what she sees about being what she calls the process of repentance in response to suffering. So Elihu argues that God does speak to people in dreams at night, which serve as a warning, and suffering in pain is the second way of warning. The role of this angelic mediator that Elihu introduces is disputed, and apparently the meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain. Does his action take place in heaven or with the sufferer on earth? However, it is a new idea. And where does the angel appeal to God for the sinner's redemption? And then if the sinner's redemption is accepted, he is then joyously restored to the presence of God, and the story is completed by the sinner recounting his redemption to the congregation. Now, the thinking behind that is very similar to the tradition of lament and thanksgiving psalms, particularly the penitential psalms. So was this a hypothetical model of behaviour that Elihu was hoping Job might follow? Newsom states that the figure of the repenting sinner was not always a stock part of Israelite moral discourse, but starts to appear in the Persian and Hellenistic periods. She draws attention to the story of Nebuchadnezzar, which in many ways is highly comparable to that of Job. Both Nebuchadnezzar and Job are guilty of pride, and God first tries to communicate to them through dreams. Indeed, Job admits he's had dreams in chapter 7, verse 14. And these dreams have required interpretation by Daniel and perhaps the angel that Elihu speaks of, respectively. The second communication is physical suffering, which both Nebuchadnezzar and Job experience. Then Daniel and Elihu's angel bring about restoration of understanding and prayers to God, resulting in return of righteousness and public thanksgiving. And Newsom, Job wasn't easy to understand. Newsom isn't always easy to understand, but she says it's the psychology and divine dimensions that Newsom sees as novel. The moral significance is what has happened to Job. The moral significance in what has happened to Job was found in the way in which Job's experience modelled the pattern of the one whom God warns in order to turn him from pride. Job's inability to understand has been likened to that of Nebuchadnezzar. Is Elihu attempting to claim for himself a role like that of Daniel, the one who tries to interpret the language of Job's suffering? So let's move on now to chapter 34, and do follow in your Bibles, of course. Hugh, Tim is going to read chapter 34, verse 1 to 6, and then 10 and 11, and 18 to 24.
Then Elihu continued and said, "Hear my words, you wise men, and give ear to me, you who know. For the ear tests words as the palate tastes food. Let us choose what is right. Let us determine among ourselves what is good. For Job has said, I am innocent, and God has taken away my right. In spite of being right, I am counted a liar. My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression. Therefore, hear me, you who have sense. Far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and from the Almighty that he should do wrong. For according to their deeds he will repay them, and according to their ways he will make it befall them. Who says to a king, "You scoundrel," and to princes, "You wicked men," who shows no partiality to nobles, nor regards the rich more than the poor, for they are all the work of his hands. In a moment they die. At midnight the people are shaken and pass away, and the mighty are taken away by no human hand. For his eyes are upon the ways of mortals, and he sees all their steps. There is no gloom or deep darkness where evildoers may hide themselves. For he has not appointed a time for anyone to go before God in judgment. He shatters the mighty without investigation and sets others in their place.
Thank you. So Elihu's claims about God's justice are not substantially different from those that the Friends have said. Elihu alludes to the words of previous speakers. In verse 3, he echoes Job's words of chapter 12, verse 11. His defense of retributive justice in verse 11, he says, "For according to their deeds he will repay them, and according to their ways he will make it befall them," echoes that exactly of Bildad in chapter 8, verse 4, and his insistence that no deep darkness can hide the acts of evildoers evokes the imagery used by Eliphaz in chapters 22, verses 13 and 14. The main thrust of this chapter is to refute Job's critique of God's just rule in chapter 12. But he focuses on the role of political power in a way that none of the other participants do, so says Newsom. Whereas Job had referred to the admirable qualities that divine wisdom makes available to human rulers, but then went on in bitterness to show how God undermines that rather than supports effective governance on earth, Elihu suggests that those with political power need to be checked by the intervention of God, a way of framing issues characteristic of the theological problem posed by the existence of Gentile rulers who exercised sovereignty over Israelites. And this was a theme developed in Jewish literature in the Hellenistic period, specifically in Daniel and Sirach. And then Newsom does an analysis between the similarities of Elihu's speeches and what is said in Daniel chapter 2 and 5. And those similarities are very striking indeed. There are apparently also similarities with Sirach chapters 9 and 10, but these are less extensive. So this thinking reflected the Jewish authors of that period who were reflecting the problem of the place of rulers in the order of things.
Yes, thank you. Can I just, yes, especially in the light of the experiences which Israel had at the hands of Persia and Greece, because we're into the period of the Greek Empire under Alexander. Some of you may be surprised at Claire's references to Daniel all this time, because Daniel is, although it's set in the Persian period with King Nebuchadnezzar, is actually one of the latest writings in the Old Testament, written during the period of Greek overlordship probably in the 3rd century.
Yes, that's a very important point that could have been very muddling. I agree. Thank you. We could now read, please, Tim, the whole of chapter 35, which is short. but I just think it gives the flavour of the whole problem. And I have just looked at my watch, and we have got time for that, so yes, please.
Plenty, yeah. Elihu continued and said, "Do you think this to be just? You say, I am in the right before God. If you ask, what advantage have I? How am I better off than if I had sinned? I will answer you and your friends with you. Look at the heavens and see. Observe the clouds which are higher than you. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give to him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness affects others like you, and your righteousness other human beings. Because of the multitude of oppressions, people cry out. They call for help because of the arm of the mighty. But no one says, where is God, my Maker, who gives strength in the night, who teaches us more than the animals of the earth, and makes us wiser than the birds of the air? There they cry out, but he does not answer, because of the pride of evildoers. Surely God does not hear an empty cry, nor does the Almighty regard it. How much less when you say that you do not see him, that the case is before him, and you are waiting for him. And now, because his anger does not punish, and he does not greatly heed transgression, Job opens his mouth in empty talk. He multiplies words without knowledge.
Well, much of what has been said in this chapter, Elihu has said already, and it really deals with his concern about God's justice and his outrage that Job has dared to question it. Dell points out, however, the focus is on himself, Elihu, as the one providing the answers where others have failed. Elihu asks, what is Job expecting could happen? He's just worsening his situation by shouting at God. Wilson, another commentator, proposes that in verse 3, Elihu is paraphrasing Job's earlier questions, what blessing comes from choosing righteousness rather than sin? Elihu hears Job as saying there's no advantage. And then, whereas Job is complaining of divine silence, Elihu perceives the absence of response as sovereign transcendence. Elihu's concern is to correct Job's ideas, not to offer pastoral comfort. So we move on from there to the final section in chapters 36 and 37. And Newsom says of this that Elihu's final speech is long and complex, but Newsom focuses on the significance of what she calls a sapiential hymn, which occurs in chapter 36 and 37. Of these chapters, she says that chapter 36, 1 to 23, summarizes the themes and reasoning he's developed in previous speeches. The next section is this sapiential hymn, which we're going to read. And the final sections are the imitation of the rhetorical questions of the divine speech, and finally a comparison between the awesome splendor of the sun and the appearance of God in glory. So those sections in chapters 36 and 37, the sapiential hymn, and these form a segue, these and Elihu's final words form a segue into the divine speeches which follow. The sapiential hymn is a novel genre in the text. It's thought that the author of Elihu was familiar with this form of speech and saw its relevance and need, finding it missing from his friend's rhetorical repertoire. Newsom wonders if this genre has not been developed when the dialogues were composed. Now, the hymn that Elihu speaks is extremely similar to one that occurs in the book of Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, which I think you won't have in your Bibles because it's in the Apocrypha. And that can be dated with some precision to the first quarter of the 2nd century BCE, i.e. early Hellenistic. The hymn is a form of poetry which displays wisdom, but also a form of spiritual discipline that cultivates a sense of the presence of God through the contemplation of God's work. The orderliness of creation, the complex complementarity which we see every week in Attenborough's programmes, the complex complementarity it exhibits and its purposefulness are all a part of what inspires the sense of beauty and delight. And now, Christine, please, she's going to read us just a little section from this hymn by Ben Sirach, from chapter 43, please.
Look at the rainbow and praise him who made it. It is exceedingly beautiful in its brightness. It encircles the sky with its glorious arc. The hands of the Most High have stretched it out. By his command, he sends the driving snow and speeds the lightnings of his judgment. Therefore the storehouses are opened, and the clouds fly out like birds. In his majesty he gives the clouds their strength, and the hailstones are broken in pieces. The voice of his thunder rebukes the earth. When he appears, the mountains shake. At his will, the south wind blows. So do the storm from the north and the whirlwind. He scatters the snow like birds flying down, and its descent is like locusts alighting. The eye is dazzled by the beauty of its whiteness, and the mind is amazed as it falls. He pours frost over the earth like salt, and icicles form like pointed thorns. The cold north wind blows, and ice freezes on the water. It settles on every pool of water, and the water puts it on like a breastplate.
Thank you, Christine. Well, Elihu's is not as beautiful as that. It's lovely, isn't it? So Elihu's hymn that we're about to hear is not a paraphrase of the divine speeches adapted for human voice, although it clearly anticipates them. And Newsom says, such hymns situate the recital in a disposition of piety, and it is to such a person that God gives wisdom. The speaker is therefore sketched as a person whose piety is marked by modesty about knowledge, even as God's unimaginable transcendence is described by paradoxical reference to its indescribability. So now, Tim, if you would just read that section of Job's sapiential hymn, please.
In red, yes. Just a bit in red.
Yes.
For he draws up the drops of water, he distills his mist in rain, which the skies pour down and drop upon mortals abundantly. Can anyone understand the spreading of the clouds, the thunderings of his pavilion? See, he scatters his lightning around him and covers the roots of the sea. For by these he governs peoples, he gives food in abundance, he covers his hands with the lightning, and commands it to strike the mark. Its crashing tells about him. He is jealous with anger against iniquity. At this also my heart trembles and leaps out of its place. Listen, listen to the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that comes from his mouth. Under the whole heaven he lets it loose, and his lightning to the corners of the earth. After it his voice roars. He thunders with his majestic voice, and he does not restrain the lightnings when his voice is heard. God thunders wondrously with his voice. He does great things that we cannot comprehend. For to the snow he says, fall on the earth, and the shower of rain, his heavy shower of rain, serves as a sign on everyone's hand, so that all whom he has made may know it. Then the animals go into their lairs and remain in their dens. From its chamber comes the whirlwind, and cold from the scattering winds. By the breath of God, ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen fast. He loads the thick cloud with moisture. The clouds scatter his lightning. They turn around and around by his guidance to accomplish all that he commands them on the face of the habitable world, whether for correction or for his land or for love, he causes it to happen.
Thank you. So we've had quite a bit of the whirlwind and the cold from the scattering winds, haven't we? Can hear them even now. So this poem can be understood not simply as a display of wisdom, but also as a form of spiritual discipline that cultivates a sense of the presence of God through the contemplation of God's work. In the contemplation of beings of creation, so intimately tied to the order of time, I'm sorry, we didn't read this, but in the phases of the moon, one may also, though never fully grasp, a sense of the glory of God who created them. That is, one may grasp the order of eternity. The one who recites such a poem is led to experience the created world in wonder as a means of disclosure of God. I was preaching on Revelation chapter 4 yesterday. I think that's what that was about as well. So, Carol Newsom's conclusion is that my governing assumption is that Elihu is not simply another character. He is the reader of the book of Job who literally writes himself into the text. Perhaps the very person whose genealogy is given in chapter 32, verse 2. The differences have been produced possibly by Elihu's close reading of and interaction with the existing book of Job, brought into conversation with his own cultural frameworks. I have to say that was a level of subtlety that was so beyond me that I would never have got it without her commentary. Never. My conclusion, so that was the conclusion of a scholar, my conclusion is, let's imagine Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite. Perhaps he's still a young man. Perhaps he's actually a lawyer by profession. But he's a devout man who studies the scriptures intently, spending hours in the temple library, taking down the scrolls and unrolling them. And then he comes across the book of Job, and like everyone before and since, thinks this is very difficult, and spends hours, days, weeks, years thinking about it. But perhaps what struck him hardest was that verse in the epilogue in chapter 42, verse 7, when God said, "After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, 'My wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has.'" Now, almost every commentator describes Elihu as making arrogant assertions, and I think we can see why. But if what Elihu believed was that he had been called to write what they should have said and speak right for God, because he says, "For I am full of words, the spirit within me constrains me." Elihu may have understood that he had divine backing to criticize. I think the other interesting question is to what extent he sees himself as a reincarnation of Daniel. Now, how he deals with the fact that God appears to approve of Job's words Yet Elihu, criticizes Job is more difficult to explain. However, Dell says Elihu's main emphasis has been on God's power and justice, which he feels Job has not properly understood. I think we can ask, does Elihu actually berate Job for his honest anger against God and his steadfast intention to maintain his integrity? That might have been the aspect of Job's behaviour that God considered right. So does this book promote honesty in theological discourse and reject reliance on tradition? Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Well, you can see that I was quite right to allocate this very difficult section to her, so thank you. We've heard the distinguished academic she is and teacher, and making clear some very difficult stuff. So that was difficult stuff, but fascinating. I find particularly fascinating her idea that Elihu is the first commentary on the book of Job. So he's the earliest reader of the book of Job. I find that quite astonishingly fascinating, and I find her link too that Claire brought out with Daniel very, very interesting, and that's something well worth pursuing. Malcolm. But while Christine's running to Malcolm, which she's not used to doing by any means, before I forget, because I will forget, next week, remember, we are taking a break. Okay, because Robert is our next speaker. He's going to be bringing God to us, which we've been waiting for. But we'll have to postpone God's speeches through Robert till the following week. So we take a break next week. So please tie a knot in your hanky. Don't come here next week, but do come the following week. Okay, right. Christine.
Thank you, Claire. Very, very well put together, if you don't mind me saying. My question is this. Do you recognize in Elihu the Spirit of God in comparison with, say, the three previous friends who've been to visit him? Secondly, whether the questions that he asked are more Spirit of God orientated than the other questions that have been asked. And then thirdly, in your own personal spiritual walk, whether you see elements of the Spirit of God in Elihu that you don't see in other people.
Claire, over to you.
I have to say I don't like Elihu. I think that he is not in any way empathetic towards Job. And I think that's a very bad position to start from. I think that I do see him as having an immense ego. And actually, I do wonder, I used to be a doctor, I do wonder if he's slightly deluded and thinking that he himself is another Daniel. And he really thinks that he thinks that he is God-inspired. I'm not sure that I do. No, I don't think he was. I actually did wonder to myself if he had a psychiatric delusional condition as I was reading this. Are you allowed to say that about things in the Bible?
You are.
Yeah, I think that would be my interpretation of Elihu. But it's interesting because all sorts of different people comment on the Bible. Some of them may well have paranoid delusions, I don't know. But I think he was one of them. But he must have convinced people at the time to get his statement in by the time they wrote the book for the Dead Sea Scrolls. So he was obviously of some influence. Perhaps he was a friend of the person who wrote Daniel, I don't know.
Thinking historically, I think it's quite understandable. I mean, I agree. I think you have to work really hard to have any sympathy with Elihu, and I think that's what Carol Newsom was really trying to do, trying to see in what way he did make a contribution to the book rather than just be a fluffy bit of padding. But I think historically, if you consider that he reflects particularly the period of intense suffering under empires of different kinds, and when he wrote the Greek Empire, then periods of intense suffering tend to lead to the search for certainty. You know, somewhere where you can stand and say, this is what I believe, without any questions. And I think that the Friends and Elihu all reflect this kind of faith that needs absolute certainty, that needs answers, that doesn't like questions at all. And we're all familiar with that kind of faith. We're all familiar with that kind of faith is dominant in Christianity throughout the world today, a faith that doesn't want questions, which says, I know what God says, and there's nothing else to say. If you disagree with me, then you are not in God. I mean, that's a very powerful voice today, and I think he reflects that kind of voice. And it's the dangerous voice of dogmatism, extremely dangerous. Yeah. Any others, or we've all been rendered silent? Yes. Thank you. Claire really made something of a very, very difficult section. Yeah, very.
This paean to effectively the sun, the weather, the powers of God, you know, we know that ourselves. You know, if you want to go and you're feeling down and you want to go and be in an uplift, you go and walk on top of a nice hill and watch a sunset or something like that. And yeah, how was this something of the Jewish thought at the time? Were they able to, see God in beauty? The rainbow is very much an image in the Old Testament.
I've just got to put my answer in before Tim answers. Absolutely. I mean, the Psalms are full of trees clapping their hands and meadows being full of corn and being happy and laughing. I think that they very much saw creation, the work of God in creation as revealing his goodness. And that's what we do when we watch Richard Attenborough, I think.
Yeah, indeed. No, I mean, this is a pre-industrial world where people's daily lives were in contact with nature. Everybody. There wasn't that separation from nature that we, living in an urban environment, tend to experience. And what Claire said is quite right. And I mean, the first creation story in Genesis indicates the extent to which nature is understood to be God's creation. And while it's not pantheistic, it's not that nature is God, but certainly God reveals himself in nature. That is part and parcel of the worldview in the Bible, I think. Judy, I think you wanted to ask something.
Remind me what hapax legomenon means.
It's something that appears only in that particular place. A bit of language, maybe a word, a phrase, whatever, which is not found anywhere else. Yeah. Or anywhere else. Not only not in the Bible, but anywhere else in the language.
Okay.
So how do they translate it?
Well, a lot of translation involves some creative, intelligent guesswork. Yeah.
I think that the fact that Newsom calls Harbell's translation over-legalistic, it just shows how you can put a spin on things if you're a translator, and who are we to argue with that? But that his translation makes it seem as if it's a scene in court. It's so legalistic. Whereas other people don't see that at all.
Yes.
And is it not true that that at the end of the book of Job, exactly how it's interpreted, it makes it...
Well, we'll get,
Yes.
at the end, we'll get into some of the most difficult passages to translate in the whole Bible. Translation is, I mean, it's always a contextual thing. So, because languages differ so much, that, one-to-one exchange of ideas is very often not possible. And all translators have a context. And when biblical translators get around a table to translate, they have an audience that they want to sell their books to. And I'm sorry, that all those things influence translations. So we've already seen that there are many cases where the pious translation is preferred because that's what the audience wants. So there are political factors involved in translation, as well as purely linguistic ones.
Is because of the dating of some of these passages, are they based on the Septuagint, or are they effectively earlier Hebrew that we're looking at? Because obviously the Dead Sea Scrolls were written in a Hebrew, but the Septuagint was what dating have we got for the Septuagint?
3rd century BCE is the Septuagint. So that's the very earliest interpretation of the Bible is the Septuagint. And if you read the book of Job in its version, you'll see there are some very considerable differences from the biblical book, because the writer is interpreting the book of Job and often adding, I think I showed you how to introduce bits about Job's wife, the absence of whom has worried commentators throughout the ages. But I wanted to say that one of the things that I think Claire has brought out very well, which is where I think the Elihu speeches are a distinct contribution to the book, is that they set the scene for God's speeches, which we'll hear Robert. So some of the bits I read out, particularly from the sapiential hymn, picks up concerns and language which we're going to hear from the voice of God when Robert leads us into God's speeches. So I think that definitely has a place in the book in kind of setting the scene for what God is going to have to say. Because many people, as we'll see, have been as puzzled by what God says as anything. Yeah.
But does that imply that God's speeches were written after Elihu's?
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Not at all. No. Because both of them, the sapiential hymn and God's, pick up imagery which is very traditional. But, I mean, the speeches may have been written late, because I said at the beginning, I think, just make sure I did remember what I said, that this book is a product of, I would say, many writers over a long period of time, in the form we have it, from very early stuff right through to quite late stuff. So there would be nothing wrong in saying, because one of the things I said was that we shouldn't assume that because later authors add to something, that doesn't mean that their work is lesser. Not in the ancient world. It may be today, but in the ancient world, adding on in an oral culture, adding on and developing what you've heard was part and parcel of the way an oral culture works. So it's quite natural. Any other questions? Okay, well, Claire, thank you very much indeed. That was marvelous. So, thanks again to Christine for running around with the microphone, and to Nico for that work without whom we really couldn't do. So thanks, Nico. So don't come next week. Do come the week after. Okay, right. Thank you. Okay, bye, everyone. Thank you very much.